As the Second World War came to an end in Europe, there was a need for vengeance by the Allied authorities, and many people had suffered greatly. They brought many German war criminals to trial, but lots more escaped any form of punishment, and the whole of Germany was in ruins and damaged. Towns and cities had been bombed into complete ruin, certain settlements had been smashed to the ground, and there was rubble lying all over the once championed Thousand-Year Reich. After World War I, Germany was punished heavily, and the imposition of the Treaty of Versailles, the Allies believed, may have led to the rise of Hitler, so they were conscious to rebuild Germany in a different way this time. But much of the physical work to rebuild the country wasn't done by former war criminals, it was actually done by women who had lived through the conflict, and those who had lost their husbands, who were away fighting the Third Reich's war in different nations. These women became known as Rubble Women, or Trümmerfrau, and they played a pivotal role in helping a country emerge from the ruins of the Second World War. Today we learn about them, and to support our channel, please click subscribe. During World War II, the Allies bombed many German towns and cities heavily. Dresden, for example, was reduced to nothing, with a firestorm that gripped the city, and this led to thousands of deaths and also a huge amount of damage. In other industrial cities such as Hamburg, hundreds of bombers carried out attacks, dropping their payloads on the city below. But at the end of the war, there were roughly 3.6 million homes and houses in dozens of cities which had been destroyed in Germany. There were also around 4 million more homes which were damaged and wrecked, and needed to be rebuilt to become habitable again. Also, 40% of the country's infrastructure had been destroyed, and factories were left ruined too. It's estimated that there were around 500 million cubic metres of rubble, a huge amount, and over 7 million people were left homeless. The story of the damage of the conflict was colossal, and women in the aftermath of the Soviet advance into Germany had to worry about the Soviets, who had a terrifying reputation for assault. Inside of Berlin, the Soviet forces would commit many terrible crimes, but as the dust settled in the months after the German surrender had been signed, and as a number of high-ranking Nazi officials were locked up, awaiting the beginning of the Nuremberg trial, something needed to be done about the rubble and the ruins of Germany. Germans themselves became used to cleaning up after Allied bombing raids, but during the war there was a lot of prisoners of war who would also do this, as well as the forced slave labourers held under submission by the Nazi groups. But as the war had come to an end, there was no POWs or forced labourers to do the work, so the everyday German civilians had to rebuild their own country. Many people volunteered to do this in exchange for basic food, such as soup, and former Nazi Party members were later conscripted into work groups by the Allies, but then women joined the clean-up. Around 1946, the Allies, who were occupying Germany in different zones, ordered all women who were aged between 15 and 50 years old to work inside of gangs to help in the post-war clean-up. At the time in Germany, because of the huge loss of life in the armed forces, there were around 7 million more women than men, so the Allies targeted them to help in the workforce. The work to begin with wasn't as effective as it could have been, as there was rubble thrown everywhere, including inside of underground stations, and this was of course not productive. But then as time went on, different private companies and groups gave different jobs for the women each week to do. They also issued women with a ration card to collect a day's food, but the food they were given was not a huge amount because of the shortage in general in Germany. They were also paid, and they worked 9-hour days, usually, and only had a 30-minute break. They were given a 72 Pfennig an hour wage. One journalist who witnessed groups of workers claimed these women forming one of the many human conveyor belts which were organised to clean up the city, passed their pools of broken bricks from hand to hand with such slow motion that I felt they calculated the minimum speed at which they could work and still draw their 72 Pfennigs an hour. The tools that the women were given were rather rudimentary, and they were given hammers, pickaxes, buckets and winches to remove larger bits of rubble and ruin. They were not given heavy machinery such as diggers to carry out the clean-up. They would pull down ruined buildings, demolish parts of them, and also gather bricks which could also be used in building projects in the future. Other items such as wooden and steel beams were recycled, as were sink basins, toilets, and other objects which could be once again put to use. The debris would be removed by wagons, lorries, and in some cases even light railways, which would take the rubble to other areas to be gathered and then used once again. There was outside of Berlin a large debris mountain, which was made from leftover rubble from buildings which had been struck by Soviet artillery. The Trümmerfrau worked whatever the weather, and they worked all across Germany to deal with the damage. For example, in Aachen, one former Trümmerfrau stated, "It was mostly women who shovelled their way through the rubble of Aachen's inner city that was totally destroyed. Just for one bowl of soup from the Americans, we hammered and dragged debris all day long. Even the pickaxe was part of our equipment. That's probably one reason why they put a memorial plaque for Aachen's Trümmerfrau at the back of the town hall." For many women, the group gave them a sense of purpose and also something positive for them to work towards. Some were given dresses to work in, mostly rag dresses, but they were also allowed to sell items which were found in buildings. Another former Trümmerfrau claimed that, "We had no hammers, no shovels, no buckets, no gloves. I wonder sometimes today how my hands are still working. I look at them and can't believe there is skin on them at all. We were totally disillusioned because as girls we had gone through the Hitler Youth groups. You had to imagine how you would react if the whole system you had been brought up in simply did not exist anymore. People could not grasp it." On many statues in Germany today showing the Trümmerfrau, a slogan exists: a woman with a hammer in her hand, her hair pulled into a handkerchief, looks determinedly into the distance. Inside of Berlin's different occupation zones, around 10% of all buildings were beyond repair, and the Trümmerfrau worked as hard as they could to clean up. They were even recognised for their graft and work, and the Allies in 1946 even published a set of stamps celebrating them, as they were said to have been the ones who were reconstructing a nation from the rubble. The German people, those who had survived the war, respected them greatly too. But one thing to consider is the fact that many of the Trümmerfrau were ladies who had lost their husbands as they had been away fighting for the Nazi cause. Many of them also had huge families, as they were encouraged to have many children by the Nazi authorities, and were even given grants and tax relief if they had more children for the Reich. They were left widows and left to raise their children on their own, and their homes had also in some cases been destroyed. They had lived through the war too, and some who were Nazis were dragged to denazification courts, but the everyday German woman was ordered to rebuild the country and conduct hard graft. The community feeling they got from working with other women to rebuild and clear up the mess of the Nazi regime was somewhat poetic, for many with women who had been oppressed under the Third Reich being the ones who cleared up the mess. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.